Hello everyone, my name's Jeanette Rowley, and as you know I'm from the Vegan Society. I work at the Vegan Society as a legal advisor. I'm also chair of the International Rights Network, and I'm also the Vegan Society's advocate. And I'd like to say thank you very much to the Estonian Vegan Society for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share my work with you. Now before I get started with the presentation, I'll just give you a bit of background about myself. I've been an animal rights activist since I was a young girl, which is way back in the last century, so we won't say for how long. I've been vegan for many decades and I've raised my children vegan. They're grown up now and I've got vegan grandchildren. So we've got a few generations of veganism going on. So we've experienced, let's say, some unfair treatment and issues of discrimination. So, you know, we've got some background experience to draw on. I started thinking more about the situation for vegans because in 2010 in the UK, we had some new equality legislation. And to inform employers about how to understand the new regulations concerning protection for non-religious belief, the Equalities Commission of the United Kingdom explained some situations by using vegan examples. So a vegan in the workplace could be accommodated, for example, if it was a big employer, by having their own kitchen facilities. If it was a small employer, maybe they could provide a separate fridge or a microwave, colour-coded cutlery, and certain cleaning products and this kind of thing. So I was, as a mother of children who were now grown up, I was really pleased that young vegans had something to point to show the validity of veganism and how their needs could be met and how their needs were being taken into account seriously by official bodies. But when the final version came out, the final code of practice, the vegan examples had been removed and replaced by different examples, more mainstream examples concerning non-religious belief. So of course I got frustrated and I thought, that's not right, because still vegans can't, you know, express themselves in terms of official documentation and so on. And I thought it was really unhelpful to take these examples out of the code of practice for employers. So I started looking into the whole area of protection for different beliefs and equality protections, and this led me into human rights research. And I discovered that protection for anyone with deep convictions isn't about traditional religions at all. It's simply about protecting anyone who lives their life on a daily basis according to their own sincerely held convictions. So I started to undertake research and I started to network around the world with vegan lawyers and vegan academics, legal academics, to start discussing the human right to freedom of conscience and how this filters through into equality law, and how there is a preference given to religious beliefs and non-religious beliefs are relegated to a large extent. And that's sort of how I got started with the network, and it's grown from there. We've now had quite a few conferences, and my work in the UK is on a daily basis. I'm dealing with vegans with specific issues of unfair treatment and discrimination. And I'm going to give you some examples about that. So I'll talk to you for about 40-45 minutes or so, and then hopefully you'll have some questions that I can answer. So I want to start by going through what I'm going to talk about. So today we're going to ask how we can bring about justice for non-human animals and try and understand how claiming our rights as vegans can help us bring justice for animals, include them in our justice system. And then I'm going to give you some examples of my work in the UK. So first of all, let's think carefully about what it is we're trying to achieve as animal rights activists. I think we'll all agree that we want an inclusive system of justice that respects animals and takes into account their legitimate moral standing. And I think we also want to bring about a society that's default compassionate rather than exploitative. So we want to remove animal prejudice. And when we think about what we want, the kind of reforms we want to bring about respect and justice for sentient animals. We want to dismantle prejudice. We want to stop animal suffering in the name of sport and entertainment. We want an end to unrepresentative commercial advertising where cows are promoted as being happy in their exploitation. We want vegan catering in hospitals, schools and all public spaces. We want a healthy environment, food security, and we want to ensure healthy diets. We want animal-free medications and food supplements, and we want animal-free infant formula. I don't know if you're aware, but when a mother is weaning a baby from breast milk, the milk that the baby goes on to has an animal ingredient in. At that stage in life, 6 months old, a baby is fed an animal product. We'd like catering qualifications to include vegan cooking, vegan baking as standard. We want policies that promote plant-based diets in international development work. We want alternatives to animal experiments. And we want vegan education in our schools. Honest education about how we treat animals, the sentiency of animals, our environment, and just honest vegan education rather than exploitative education. And I think we have to think about, as animal rights activists, we have to think about how we are trying to achieve these goals. Popular methods are that we join animal rights groups, we join vegetarian groups, we participate in various campaigns. Some of us contribute to international academic literature about veganism and animal rights and try to disseminate our ideas globally. We've got environmental pressure groups. But when we think about all this grassroots activism and all the different kinds of strategies we can get involved with, we've got to ask ourselves, what kind of institutional support do we have? Is there any form of institutional support apart from animal welfare measures that don't really release animals from their exploitation and the system of prejudice? And I think it's fair to say that there are two main approaches to animal rights. The first one is the animal welfare approach, and the main objective is to improve conditions for animals in their exploitation. And the second one is to try and bring about abolition. Now, you might know Gary Francioni's work in this area. Gary Francioni believes 100% in vegan education and also incremental prohibitions to remove the right to exploit animals. Now, I think to bring about a society that is compassionate and non-exploitative, these two main areas of activism both have their limits and their opportunities. But I think we're missing a really important strategy. And that strategy is focusing on us and our rights, not instead of animals and their rights, but to complement the grassroots activism and the other strategies that are taking place. And I think if we promote our rights, if we promote veganism in law and use law to protect vegans and grow veganism, we're not asking for anything different or new. All we're doing is using existing law and legal provisions and legal principles. And I think if we're going to talk about animal rights and try to bring about animal rights, we've got to also ask, how can we achieve a society that gives regard and respect to animal rights if we haven't already got in place any policies or regulations that allow us as humans to manifest that respect for animal rights? So in a way, what we're saying is our right to be compassionate towards animals, our right to include them in our system of justice, is our right. we have this right. It's called the right to freedom of conscience. And I think this can make a huge difference. And I like to think of it as a string to the bow of all the other strategies. Now, if we think about social change, we can see it as a two-way process. We can see it working from the bottom up. So the values of society, we can change opinions and then that can influence law. Or we can have a legal provision that changes opinions and then it becomes a moral position. So if we look closely at a bottom-up approach, we have our campaigning, grassroots organisations, vegan organisations, animal rights organisations or welfare organisations. And these organisations, through their campaigns and through activism, change the values of society, and then eventually we can influence law. And we can see that this is what's happened over time with animal welfare laws. They've been brought about because we've shown as a society that we disagree with the way some animals have been treated and law should intervene. And we've seen this in the UK. We've got protections for different species, badges and so on. It's not enough, but we can see how we have this effect. But we can transform society with a top-down approach as well. So this is where law will dictate a moral position. That changes society's views, and eventually it becomes a normal way of life, a moral way of thinking, and society can be transformed by legal provisions. So when we talk about vegan rights, I think it's important to think of it as a strategy that is a top-down approach to meet the bottom-up approaches, and it as an additional strategy. I don't think for 1 minute that claiming vegan rights in law is going to transform society overnight, but I think it can go a good way towards normalising veganism and helping society transition into mainstream veganism. So how do we start the process of using law to promote veganism and protect vegans? So obviously, first of all, we need to recognise the legal principles and provisions that we can use them to support individual vegans, to bring about changes we need to see in the public sector. So what's really important to me is that we get vegan food on the menu in schools for vegan children. Parents often speak to me about the lack of provision of vegan food in school. And I think it's important as well to make sure we get standard vegan provision in hospital for vegans in hospital and in care homes, and vegan food in prisons as well. I think we need reform in terms of our rights as consumers. So vegans as consumers don't suffer any unfair treatment or discrimination. I don't know how it is for you in your environments, but certainly in the UK I get lots of emails from vegans who feel unfairly treated, and I'll give you some examples of those. So I'm going to now talk about the laws that we can use, but I'm giving a presentation tomorrow where I'll go into more detail about the technical aspect of law and different treaties and so on. I'm going to try and keep it a bit simple because I'm assuming you're all lay people, but afterwards if you've got any technical questions or you can engage with the technical details, I'm more than happy to have a chat with you. So the provision is very basic. It's the human right to freedom of conscience. And this goes right back to the very beginning of establishing human rights with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At Article 18, it says that everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion, and the right to manifest their convictions in public or in private. And as vegans, we know that our daily lives are directed by our veganism. From the moment we wake up until the moment we go to bed, we've thought many times about how we can avoid exploiting non-human animals and what our choices are. And we've made many choices throughout the day. This means that we're living our lives according to our convictions about animal rights and the moral standing of animals. And we're making choices every day to limit our impact and make sure we don't contribute to their suffering as much as we can. So we have to think, therefore, how does this relate to the human right to freedom of conscience? And we might think that the right to freedom of conscience concerns religion only, but it doesn't. The right to freedom of conscience concerns anyone who lives their life according to deep convictions. And as you know, the Universal Declaration also provides that everyone will be treated equally. Now, the Universal Declaration isn't itself law. It has no legal effect. But the principle, the right to freedom of conscience, is given legal effect internationally through a very important covenant. And it's given effect in the European system of human rights in the form of the European Convention on Human Rights. And the relevant article, if anyone's interested, is Article 9, the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. And that article basically repeats the provision in the Universal Declaration and the provision in the Covenant. Now, the international provision for the right to freedom of conscience explains a bit more about what this right entails. And it states very clearly that we have the right to freedom of conscience, and it's an absolute right to believe in what you want to believe in. We have the right to manifest our convictions in our daily lives. We have the right to be free from assimilation and coercion. And the international right to freedom of conscience also gives us the right to respect for our moral convictions in the education of our children. And I think this is a really important form of law that the vegan community has been missing out on. Under the European Convention of Human Rights, we also have the right to believe absolutely in veganism and manifest our vegan convictions, and the right to equality. And the right to education is also brought into the European Convention as a protocol. Also, the European Charter is built on equality and respect for human rights. We have the same right to freedom of conscience, the same wording is used, and a right to equality. So I said earlier that the right to freedom of conscience doesn't only concern traditional religions, Christianity, Muslim, Sikh, whatever. It concerns our practice, our practical manifestation of our convictions, and in our case it's convictions about the rights of non-human animals. Now, the Human Rights Committee have explained what the right to freedom of conscience means, and what they've said is this right is far-reaching and profound. So they're saying, just by saying that, they're saying no state should limit the right to freedom of conscience. It shouldn't be limited in any way, just by saying it's far-reaching and profound. They've also said it's broad in scope. So again, they're indicating that it shouldn't be limited at all in any way. They've said it's relevant to all matters of personal conviction. They've said it's not limited to traditional religions. And it's also not limited to beliefs with institutional characteristics or practices. And they've also said that there must be no discrimination of anyone with a belief for any reason, not even if the belief is a new idea. Now this year, the Vegan Society is celebrating 75 years of the Vegan Society, and we can say the vegan society, the vegan movement from the beginning is a new idea. But history shows us that, respect for animals and the recognition of animal suffering goes back many hundreds of years. We don't have to read much literature to acknowledge that. But even if it was 75 years, the Human Rights Committee have said that there should be no discrimination of anyone who lives their life according to deep convictions, even if it's a new idea. And this is quite common sense, really, because society evolves, new ideas come about, and the vegan society, the vegan movement, we can say 75 years ago, was a new idea, and it's spread all over the world. So as a new idea, humans have bought into it because we want to be compassionate, we want to respect other animals. And it's grown, and the Human Rights Committee obviously recognised that this is what happens with human evolution. And so they've said that even new ideas can come within the legal meaning of the right to freedom of conscience. Now, veganism has been heard at the European Court of Human Rights in the 1990s. A prisoner from the UK was required to work in the prison print facility He was rotated as part of his imprisonment. He must work in certain departments. And for a period of time, he would be working in the prison print shop. And he didn't want to work with the dyes because he said they've probably been tested on animals or they're animal derived in some way. But the prison said, well, you have to because that's the prison rule. So he took his case to the European Court of Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights didn't have an extensive discussion about whether his vegan principles came within the scope of an Article 9 claim, the right to freedom of conscience. In fact, there was no discussion at all. The case report is extremely small. And it's a bit, when you read the case report and see that there was no discussion about the vegan prisoner's convictions, and they just automatically agreed that, yes, his convictions about animals are well within the meaning, the legal meaning of the right to freedom of conscience. It makes you think, well, if there's no discussion and it's so obvious to judges, why do we have such a society that's so prejudiced against animals when it's clear to everyone that vegan convictions make absolute sense? So he took his case and the court said, yes, you have a right under Article 9. Vegan convictions can be protected at the level of human rights. So generally speaking, we have the right to believe in veganism and be vegan every day, make choices without interference, unless there's a law that's required in a democracy for a very good reason. And a very good reason will be to protect the rights and fundamental freedoms of other people, or to protect social order or public morality. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how I use law to protect vegans and promote veganism, and I think this will help you put the idea into context. So the human right to freedom of conscience, granted by the European Convention or internationally, is a protection for you when you are in relationships with the state or state authorities. So we're not talking about when you go to the local shop or supermarket when we talk about the human right to freedom of conscience. But we are talking about your relationship with public authorities, such as the education system, the health authority, in my case, the National Health Service in the UK. If you have relatives, vegan relatives in care homes, we're talking about your relationship with the police or being in detention or custody or in prison. And we need to keep in mind that because we're protected by the right to freedom of conscience, everybody who's a public servant working for the government in state entities must respect our veganism and give due regard to our needs as vegans, and not interfere with our right to be vegan or try to get us to assimilate into the views of dominant majority or coerce us in any way or try to get us to deny our veganism. And do what they can to support us, because that's treating us equally. If a school provides a standard menu for all the children, but a different menu for Muslim children, kosher diet, then, and a vegan parent asks for vegan food and the school says, no, we don't provide vegan food, that's not treating a group of people equally. So I'll give you some examples of how this plays out in practice. So an example of state interference might be psychological pressure to abandon veganism or assimilate into a dominant majority. In our case, it would be the dominant views of a non-vegan community. So the first example I'm going to give you is my situation where a vegan in school was encouraged to participate in a class that was talking about the values of dairy milk. And because she was vegan, she wanted to talk about the vegan view of the dairy industry. And she was told not to speak about veganism. The class wasn't interested in vegan views, and if she wants to participate, she must participate in the actual discussion about the values of dairy milk. This is a teacher, a public official, it's a state entity, it's state education, telling a vegan child to be quiet, basically, who had valid views, valid contribution. That's another case I've dealt with. I've also dealt with a case of a vegan with an eating disorder being told to abandon her moral thinking. Now, can you imagine a doctor or a nurse telling a Muslim to abandon their moral thinking? You just wouldn't believe it. And I think we're sort of conditioned to accept that that would be legitimate because religion is respected in law. But if someone says that to a vegan, then we don't give it as much attention because veganism isn't as important in law. But it is. We have the right to freedom of conscience. We have the right to be treated equally. Therefore, if somebody who works for the state, for the government, tells a vegan to abandon their moral thinking, this is psychological pressure to abandon their convictions. And it could be coercion or or an attempt to assimilate the vegan into the views of the dominant majority. Recently, I had a call from a man in his 40s. His mother had recently had a stroke. And because she'd had a stroke, she was taken into a care home and she had limited capacity. And he phoned me because he was distraught. The elderly lady had been vegan. I think he said she'd been vegan for about 55 years. So she was, long-term vegan. And they were trying to get her to eat meat. One of the care workers had said, she won't know the difference, or words to that effect. So this again, although she had limited capacity, that's no excuse for treating somebody badly or trying to get them to assimilate into a different culture, if you like. So this is an example of state interference, psychological pressure to move away from your convictions and move into another set of convictions that are not yours and were never yours. Another example of state interference is complete denial that you have relevant ethics. This can cause real difficulties because, let's say, I deal with prisoners as well who are sometimes not given vegan food and they are denied the legitimacy of their beliefs. So everybody gets food in prison according to their ethical orientation. Muslims will get different food, there'll be kosher food, but vegan prisoners are not given food. Now, in the UK, vegan prisoners actually get a really good diet. It's much better than when you go in hospital in the UK. And I think that's because we've had the vegan prisoners support group since about the mid-1990s or somewhere around then. But the European Court of Human Rights has heard cases from Poland and Romania from prisoners who wanted a diet that gave respect to all, that was compassionate to all sentient life. And they'd been denied food in prison by their local authorities. But the European Court of Human Rights had granted them their case. They won their case because the judges said, diet is an expression of your ethics. It's an expression of your convictions. And you might think that a vegan prisoner sending a case to the European Court of Human Rights when they are so overworked and they receive thousands and thousands and thousands of cases every year, you might think that they would think this was a trivial case, throw it out, there's much more important human rights concerns, let's just deal with something more important. But the truth is, the right to freedom of conscience is one of our most important human rights, and the European Court of Human Rights take it very, very seriously. We have the right to live according to our deep convictions, and when these cases go to the European Court of Human Rights, they don't regard them as trivial at all. And in one of the cases, I think in the case of the Romanian prisoner, there were actually 17 different options on the menu, and they still said the prison will have to provide this person with a suitable diet. Austria as a nation doesn't recognise veganism as relevant in their legislation for non-religious belief. And a case I dealt with a few years ago was denial of protection for vegans by lawyers in the UK. This was a case where a police officer had requested some non-leather shoes to go to work in. The police force had said, no, you can't have them. The leather shoes were the default shoes given. So she wanted to take her case to the tribunal, and the lawyers acting for the police force actually said that veganism is not relevant for legal purposes in any way. So, this is denial. Another example of state interference is where public officials make derogatory comments about a community that has an ethical orientation to the extent that it influences the dominant majority to have a prejudice towards that community. So in my case, the Justice Secretary of all secretaries, Michael Gove, when he was Justice Secretary, he referred to us as lettuce-munching, sandal-wearing vegans. And, you know, we can take a joke. We make jokes ourselves. I'm sure you've all got vegan jokes and you don't mind a joke. But when a public official says something like that and it's recorded in parliamentary papers, it goes beyond the boundary, because this is a person who has quite a powerful status and, you know, I suppose society looks up to these people to be behaving in a, you know, a respectable manner, and they shouldn't be speaking like that about any ethical group. He wouldn't have said that about any Christian organisation or any Muslim organisation. He wouldn't have got away with it, but he got away with it because it's just the vegans. And I think derogatory comments as well are becoming much more frequent. In the recent past, I've dealt with 3 examples where vegans are now being referred to as extremists and accused of radicalising young people. And you won't believe one of the examples I have. This is a mother who bakes cakes for the school fair every year. She took her cakes this year, and as the children go up to the table to buy a cake, she talks to them about veganism. Now, the school have told her that she can no longer have a stall at the school fair because she's radicalising the young children. Another case I had, a lady from the HR department phoned me to say that a vegan was using emotional terrorism in the workplace. You are allowed to talk about your ethical convictions in the workplace, whatever they are, whether you're a religious person or a non-religious person with a specific belief that could be protected in law. You are allowed to talk to a reasonable level. You can explain the principles, you can try and persuade people of your argument, but I think emotional terrorism is taking it a little bit too far. I'm sure no vegan is guilty of emotional terrorism. But of course, the subject matter might be alarming for some people, so they might see it as upsetting and therefore blame us for their upset. And, you know, confronting what people are involved in can be quite challenging for them, and it's easy to blame us. We're just passing the information on. We're not participating in it. The third example I have is that in the UK we have a strategy to prevent radicalisation, and it's just called the Prevent Strategy. And local authorities are employing independent contractors to go around explaining and teaching schools and social workers how to look out for radicalising strategies among people. And one of the people employed to go and give a talk about radicalisation referred to the vegan community as a group to watch out for in terms of radicalising young people. And this Prevent strategy, well, you all know what it's about. It's about preventing real high-level serious terrorism in all of our societies. So veganism shouldn't be on that list, but I'm finding increasingly they are on the list. So these are a few examples in those 3 categories of human rights, what I would call violations. And, you know, we shouldn't think about calling these situations human rights violations, because although they're not the really serious consequences of human rights violations that we see around the world, it's a violation in terms of our right to live according to our freedom of conscience. We shouldn't be assimilated, we shouldn't be denied, we shouldn't be coerced, and so on. Now, in addition to human rights legislation that we can invoke when a vegan is in a relationship with a state body, in the UK we also have quite broad equality law. And under our equality law, we're protected on the basis of what we call protected characteristics, and there's 9. One is sex, one is age, one is disability. You see where it's going. One of them is religion and belief. And the Equality Act protects people with religious beliefs and non-religious beliefs equally. And our protection under the Equality Act for non-religious belief is directly related to the human right to freedom of conscience. In fact, the guidance for our equality law concerning that provision is that it will take note of all of the principles and case outcomes at the European Court of Human Rights. What it's basically saying is that there should be no limit and that it's broad in scope. So we can use the protected characteristic religion and belief to support vegans. So I'm going to give you a few examples now of the kind of situations I've dealt with in my daily work. There are 4 areas of discrimination: direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, harassment and victimisation. Now, direct discrimination of a vegan would be, for example, if a job advertisement said vegans can't apply. Now, how I would approach the situation is ask the person who's put the advertisement up whether or not there was an occupational requirement, because that's the only real exception. You can't discriminate in recruitment unless there's an occupational requirement. And if there's no occupational requirement, then I would ask them to amend the advertisement. And I do have an example of direct discrimination in recruitment to tell you as well. Now, another case concerning direct discrimination. This is in the provision of financial services. A vegan who worked as a care assistant was supporting people with their dietary requirements, and she knew that the vegan diet was healthy, so she wanted to take a course in vegan nutrition to be better informed. So she phoned the bank and asked for a loan. She wanted £500 for the course. And this is the NatWest Bank who made... Did anyone see this? Yeah, I think it was on social media. So she asked the NatWest Bank if she could have a loan, and she was on the phone to one of the advisors. And they were having a chat, and he said, "What do you want the money for?" And she said, "I want to do a vegan nutrition course." And at that point, the loan advisor said, "Oh, all vegans should be punched in the face." Now, I don't think he would have said that to a Christian, a Muslim, a Sikh, or a Jew. I don't think he would have said that to a disabled person or anybody else. Now, given that vegans can be protected under our equality law, we can think of this in terms of discrimination. Now, the bank has 33,000 employees. So what is it teaching in its equality and diversity policy? So here is an opportunity for me to say to the bank, "You've discriminated against a vegan. That's wrong. You need to change your diversity policy." So we did get a good amount of compensation for this vegan. She was initially offered about £75 by the bank, but we used the equality compensation scales and we actually got a lot more for her. But that's by the by, really. I mean, she did get to pay for her nutrition course and she didn't have a loan. But what's the biggest single most important thing for me from this was that NatWest had to pay. They have 33,000 employees. Veganism is now on their equality and diversity policy, and they'll be carefully training their employees to treat vegans with the same respect as everyone else. And this means that we get a kind of normalisation of veganism. And the job I was talking about earlier, this is the National Health Service. I don't know if any of you saw this. This would have been on social media as well. The National Health Service applies for a food occupational therapist. And they said vegans can't apply. They just assumed that a vegan wouldn't be able to comply with the requirements to be a food occupational therapist. They just assumed that, and that's direct discrimination. Now, of course, I initially would like to rant and rave and, get all angry, but you can't. You have to write a nice letter and ask, why did you do that? Do you have an occupational requirement? Do you understand your equality duty? And so on and so on. I think I got a reply that was just one line. "We have changed our advertisement," or something like that. No engagement with me whatsoever. But they took down the job advertisement and replaced it with another one, encouraging vegans to apply, because they knew, oh dear, what have we done? And that's important because the health service promotes healthy diet. They stand by a vegan diet, so to discriminate against vegans is totally illogical and unreasonable. And they're a big employer, so now veganism is on their radar as well, which is really important to normalise veganism. Now, Now, in terms of indirect discrimination, so direct discrimination in the UK is where you have, where you deny somebody a service or goods just because of their protected characteristics. So just because they're a man, just because they're a woman, just because they are disabled, or just because they're vegan. That's how we think of it. Indirect discrimination is not intentional discrimination. It's just the effect of an apparently neutral policy or practice. So let's say in the workplace, everybody is rotated to clean out the fridge, but it's always full of really disgusting things that you as vegans, animal rights activists might not want to touch, smell, see, and so on. So a vegan might want to be exempt from cleaning the fridge on good grounds. So this apparently neutral policy of everybody chipping in to clean the fridge would have a detrimental effect on the vegan, because they would be disadvantaged, because they'd be dealing with something they would be upset with. A common example I have is construction workers and engineers. When they change jobs, they are usually given a catalogue to choose their construction footwear, and most of the time this is leather footwear. So it's changing a little bit now, I've noticed. 6 or 7 years ago I was dealing with this quite a lot, but now it seems like synthetic shoes are included in the catalogue. But the discriminatory policy is the fact that there are no vegan options in the catalogue for construction workers to choose their personal protective safety equipment. So in the most recent case I had, I think it was a surveyor who needed to go out on site. He was given the company catalogue to choose his shoes from, and there were no vegan options. So he approached HR and said, "Can I order my own?" And they said, "No, the policy is you must order from the company catalogue." So of course he's really unhappy with that and a little bit worried, because he's just changed jobs and he didn't want to wear leather shoes. So he phoned me, and within the same day the company changed their policy and said, yes, you can order your own boots, because I informed them that this is indirect discrimination under the Equality Act. A vegan must be given due regard the same way as anyone else. So at the end of that day he was able to get his own safety boots. And I think it's becoming more common now that companies include synthetic shoes in their catalogues. Indirect discrimination. Another example where schools provide food for all children, special diets on the basis of religious need, but there's no food for vegan children. And this is happening on a daily basis in the UK. I get emails and phone calls all the time from parents saying, I can't get vegan food for my child. Or sometimes they get vegan food, but the food is so boring and repetitive, it's not provided in equal quantity or equal quality. And the policy can be argued to be indirect discrimination, because it's apparently neutral. The school thinks everybody can eat the food, but the vegan can't, and quite often they end up taking packed lunches. So in addition, the Equality Act in the UK imposes a duty on all public sector officials to monitor and record how they're doing with inclusion and diversity. So they're under a statutory duty to show how they're complying with inclusion requirements. And most of the time, my work is about explaining the principle of non-discrimination and saying how they're under a duty to accommodate and give due regard to vegans. Now, harassment under our equality law is extremely broad. Harassment is when somebody is made to feel intimidated or threatened or made to feel bad in some way. And the way people can be made to feel bad is extremely broad. It can be spoken or written words. It can be offensive emails, tweets, or comments on social media. It can even be drawings. It can be physical gestures. It can be facial expressions or jokes and banter that's gone too far. And this provision is the one I deal with most of all. Unfortunately, this provision is only available to people in the workplace. And an important example I have of this is a young social work student who was just finishing the social work programme. And at the end of the programme, all of the social workers got together at the university to offer support to each other, because they'd just gone through a programme of personal exposure and a lot of revealing work for themselves, and there'd been a nice community developed. So the teacher had suggested that they all write a little comment for each other and fold the paper over and pass it to the relevant person. And when the vegan student opened her paper, all she saw was a fox's head with a gun pointing at it. And of course, in that environment where you're expecting supportive comments from your colleagues, because that's the nature of the class that day, you can imagine that shock. Imagine yourselves just being in that environment and opening a paper like that to see something so horrific and shocking. Now, harassment isn't available in education, so there was very little that the university could do, but it still could be discriminatory, but it couldn't be pursued at the university. They didn't pursue it beyond a minor investigation. But if that happened in the workplace, then there could be different kind of consequences. Because of employers' duty to make sure that everything's harmonious in the workplace, basically. So harassment is any unwanted behaviour that makes you feel uncomfortable. And the most frequent complaint I have from people in the workplace is the jokes and banter. Vegans often tell me that they have a joke at work, it's fine, but over a period of time, when it gets too much, it can become quite stressful and lead to severe anxiety. On Monday this week, I wasn't actually working, but I took the call anyway. 4 minutes past 9 in the morning, which tells me somebody's been waiting for 9 o'clock Monday morning to speak to me. 4 minutes past 9, I speak to a vegan who is instantly in tears the minute she speaks to me. And she told me she couldn't go into work that day. So first of all, I need to get her to calm down and try and explain to me what the problem is. And the problem is, she was told to F off and leave on Friday. She had a bacon sandwich dangled in front of her face, and the person doing that saying, "Oh, you can't eat it, can you?" And lots of other comments like that. Now that's not funny. That's not a joke anymore. It's gone beyond joking. She'd only been there for 3 months, and she'd got to the stage where she can no longer go in, and to the stage where she's probably spent all weekend dying for Monday morning to come so that she could phone me. It was 4 minutes past 9. And bless her, she was in floods of tears more than once on the phone call. The person making these jokes and saying F off and leave to her was her manager. My first suggestion to an employee in the workplace would be speak to your manager. But how can you speak to your manager if it's your manager? So in that situation, obviously there's lots of discrimination going on. If she's been told to F off and leave with her vegan ethics as well, it's quite serious. So that situation has been dealt with by one of our network lawyers at the moment. But harassment in the workplace has to be taken very seriously, whether you're a religious person or a non-religious person. So I usually advise vegans to refer to their Equality and Diversity Officer or their line manager, or escalate to make a formal complaint. But the problem is with people in the workplace, they are already suffering if things have gone too far. They're already at a stage where they dread going into work, dread conferences, dread lunch times, they just dread the office banter. So I think, for me personally, I think the approach isn't to get vegans to go through any kind of legal actions or formal complaints anymore. It's for the vegan societies to support employers to understand their duties in terms of anti-discrimination law. And we have a case in the UK, I don't know if you know it, the Geordie Castro, I can never say his surname, Geordie's case, who used to work at the League Against Cruel Sports. Do you know? That's the one, yeah, thank you. This case, it keeps getting put back. We're due in court now on January the 3rd and 4th, or 2nd and 3rd, I can't remember. And the Employment Tribunal will determine whether veganism is a belief that can be protected under our equality law. But we've already been doing all the work anyway, because there's loads of evidence that supports veganism being protected. So what we're doing once we've had a decision from that case is distribute a supportive booklet for employers to explain what the duty is towards vegans, because it's hard to get vegans to take a case when they're already suffering and anxious and they don't really want to get involved in any more difficult time at work. It's just too uncomfortable. Also, there's a fourth area of discrimination, that's victimisation. But victimisation is what you can talk about if you've raised an issue under the Equality Act and then you're treated worse. So I wasn't really going to go into any detail about it. So, for example, the lady I spoke about who phoned me on Monday, if she goes back into work and says that she's taking a grievance procedure under the Equality Act and then she's treated worse, she will also have a claim for victimisation. That's the way it works. So I think, generally speaking, we have the right to freedom of conscience as vegans, and we have the right to be given due regard when we're in relationships with state authorities, and that includes schools, hospitals, care homes, prison, police force, detention, any public official, local authority. And the right to freedom of conscience in our equality law is directly related to that human rights principle. And the question is, as animal rights activists, what use are we going to make that, how are we going to make that work for us? How are we going to make that useful for us to bring about a society that normalises veganism? Because once we've got that normalisation, then surely more people will just, accept that that's a normal moral position that they can also follow. So, I'd like to open up a discussion or take questions.